On the Jacob Viewer Show today, I am so happy to talk to Bob Crippen. As I should probably say, astronaut Bob Crippen. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing just fine.
So do you mind telling us a little bit about your background? You served in the military. You got picked originally in 1966 for the special project, and then ended up getting selected in 1969, just shortly after Apollo 11. What was it kind of like going through, being in the military and then eventually being picked by NASA? What got you into the military and then eventually connected with NASA becoming an astronaut? What was that background kind of like, if you don't mind me
Well,
starting with that question?
I grew up wanting to fly, and I was a sophomore in college when Russia put up the first Sputnik. And I'd read enough about rockets to know that if we put a satellite up, we were probably going to follow it up with people shortly. And then about a year or so later, the Mercury 7 astronauts were named, and I noticed that they were all military test pilots, and of the seven, four of them were naval aviators. So I thought that might be a good path to go higher and faster if I went to flying. So after college, with a degree in aerospace engineering, I joined the Navy and went into a pilot training program. Became an attack pilot. Served on the USS Independence, and following the approaching the end of that tour, I applied for test pilot school, uh, and the Navy and the Air Force exchange people to their schools, and I ended up being selected for the Air Force. And Chuck Yeager was the commandant of the school when I went to it. You may have heard that name. Anyway, after as I was graduating from that program, both NASA and MOL, the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, uh, DoD program, requested astronaut applicants. So I, like most people at the school, put our name in, and I ended up being selected for the military program. Uh, and we were based out of LA and going to fly out of Vandenberg Air Force Base. But after a couple of years, for various technical and money reasons, that program was canceled, and we had 14 crew members on board MOL at that time, and seven of us, everybody that was 35 and younger, transferred over to the NASA astronaut office. So that's how I ended up there.
Interesting. And of course you were on a sky you were on Skylab, some of their backup stuff, had a crucial part in that. After that it ended pretty much, and we had done things like, hey, humans are can live in space for up to 84 days at that point with Skylab 4. The space shuttle was announced. It wasn't going to be able to get up there in enough time to save the if I'm correct, space station
Yeah,
at the time. So
right.
they couldn't. It ended up deorbiting and ended up coming back through our atmosphere and broke up everywhere. A lot of pieces over Australia. But what was it like when you found out that you're going to be flying the space shuttle? Of course, they had done a lot of ALT tests, things like that. You were on your crew member for the first flight was with a very experienced guy who had done Gemini missions, two Apollo missions, John Young, in charge of the astronaut office. What was that kind of like? Getting to train with somebody that closely. Did it make you feel more comfortable going on the space shuttle mission with somebody who had been to space 4 other times?
Well, when you're a rookie going up space, it's nice to be going with a veteran like John. He, as you said, was our most experienced astronaut, having those four flights, including walking on the moon and on Apollo 16. So I became very close to John. We trained for like 3 years prior to that first flight. And the training, working with John and working with the people that were building the shuttle was what gave me confidence in it.
Interesting. And what was it like, of course, that flight? The shuttle was a new thing. They still were painting it white at the time until they later decided a couple flights in it's a waste of time. So they left it that way. Everything's brand new. You're on the Columbia, if I'm correct, for the first flight. What is the experience like? This is a new thing, even though we've made it to the moon and we've done things where people have lived in space for up to 84 days. This is still a new system. It comes back to Earth like a plane, takes off like a rocket. What was kind of going through your mind, if you recall, that first time sitting there on a launch pad, being part of a new space day and age? What was that experience like?
Well, flying the shuttle was going to be quite different from things we'd done previously. As you said, First, we had never flown or put people on board a spacecraft that hadn't been flown unmanned. And John and I were going to be on the very first flight of the space shuttle. And there was discussions about that, but that was the right thing to do as far as we were concerned. Solid rockets to get it going into space was different. We hadn't done that with humans before. And as you mentioned, it was a winged vehicle. It was going to come back in and land on the runway as opposed to parachuting into the ocean. So it had lots of firsts going for it, and us test pilots, we like first. So I was happy to be going on the mission, and I was very excited. When we were counting down the first time, I thought we'll probably end up scrubbing the launch because it's a very complicated vehicle and something's going to go wrong. And sure enough, it did. We had a little problem with our computers, but some smart people solved that. And 2 days later, we went out and tried again. I still wasn't very confident, but it was only when the count got inside of 1 minute that I told John I thought we might really do it, and we did.
Interesting. And what would you say is something you were in space, if I'm correct, a little over 2 days on that first mission, which the shuttle later been used for, anywhere from really 7 to 14 days, or if it was a military mission, more like 4 or 5 days. What was it just kind of like coming back on that flight? Of course, it was dangerous. It was a new thing going through reentry. What was it like when you landed? And what was interesting about your flight, STS-1, is in the future, they used Kennedy Space Center to runway there. But for the first one, they had landed you guys at an Air Force base in California. What was it kind of like landing like that? And then, if I was correct, President Reagan was there to see the inaugural landing of it. What was that process kind of like coming back, making it back safely and everything?
Well, when we got on orbit the first time, we noticed that we had some tiles missing in the rear end of the spacecraft, and that had some people concerned about did we have any missing off the bottom, which we didn't, fortunately. And our mission at that on the first flight was just to make sure that the space shuttle would do the basic things that it had been built to do, to get it up into orbit, check out all the systems, and then bring it back and land on a runway. And we chose going to the lake bed because the lake bed out at Edwards gives you a lot more options than a runway that's got limited access to it. So we did several of the first flights to the lake bed, and the entry was very exciting. It was dark. We were on the dark side of the earth at that time when we started entry, and we got a nice fiery pink glowing outside the spacecraft. But as soon as we hit daylight, you couldn't see that anymore. We didn't have communication until we came briefly over Hawaii, and that was we checked in with the ground there, and then we came in over sort of mid part of California, and we could see Edwards Air Force Base when we came over the coastline, and we set up. Now we confused people. John was the commander, and I was the pilot. Really, John was the pilot, and I was the co-pilot. None of us red hot test pilots want to be called a co-pilot, I guess. I was mainly working systems. Anyway, John took over. We were over Edwards Air Force Base at about 40,000 feet, and started a gentle left turn to line up with the runway. Did that when he went into the bank. I looked out John's window, and there were thousands of people out on the lake bed, and I was hoping they weren't on the runway, which fortunately they weren't. But a lot of people had come out of Los Angeles to see the landing. Anyway, John lined up, did a beautiful job landing the spacecraft. And if you've ever seen some of the video of him coming out of the spacecraft, he was really excited. I've never seen John that excited before. He's normally was a cool, calm person, but that was exciting for both of us.
Interesting. And of course, it was a day, just like with the SpaceX launch that they had done a couple months after COVID in May. It was, a big deal to see two astronauts, or yeah, two. It was Doug Hurley at the time and
Right.
another one, and they had ended up going into space, and it was the first time in 9 years we had launched from U.S. soil into space again. So it had a lot of people excited. So I see what you mean
Including
there.
me.
Yeah.
I was glad to see us flying from the US again.
Yep, I think every astronaut I've ever talked to has said that one. Um, so what would you say kind of in your own thoughts, when we got the Artemis program coming up, they selected Artemis 2 earlier this month or last month, like April 3rd. We'll be going around the moon next year in November, hopefully, and then landing in 25 or 26. And then there's also a private mission called Dear Moon. I don't know if you've heard about it. I don't think it'll be in a year like they say, but they're doing a similar thing like Artemis 2. They're going to go around the moon and it's all privately funded, this one. They've already picked the crew. They don't have a date because the Starship has still been having some things go on. But when do you kind of think, we'll get to Mars, the next beyond place, or what are your kind of thoughts on that? Because with Artemis, it has a goal to not just be the moon. It's just the start, as they have said. So when do you think we'll kind of land on Mars? Do you think it'll be by 2030?
Well, first we need to get back to the moon and learn to live off of this planet on another body. And the moon's only a couple of days away, and Mars is like 6 months. So it's going to take us a while before we're ready to go to Mars. But hopefully, within the next couple of decades, we will. One of the things we need to do is improve our propulsion system so we can reduce that 6 months that it takes to get there. And there are people working on ways to do that.
Interesting. And if you had to pick, and this is kind of just a fun question, and you don't have to say planet Earth, although this is the best place in the solar system in terms of living. What's been a planet that's always fascinated you in our solar system? Not getting involved with all the Keplers, because there's about a billion out there, literally more than a billion out there. What would you say? Is it Saturn? Is it Mars? Is it Venus, Mercury? If you had to pick one, which one besides Earth fascinates you the most?
It has to be the one because it's the nearest one to us. And, there's a potential we can find that there was life on Mars, and that will be very interesting. So I think we'll take that step first before we try to venture out to maybe some of the moons of Jupiter or something else.
Interesting. And kind of one last thing I want to end with, because I don't want to keep you for too long, is where do you see commercial space going? Neil, who's a big time physicist, sure you've heard of him, Neil McTyson, he has said that he thinks by 2040, things such as cancer will be cured. But one of the things that he said is he thinks that there will be no governments involved in the space agency and that it will be all commercial, which you can say it already is. Even the space shuttle was not built by NASA. It was built by, different companies like the solid rocket boosters.
Right, sure.
What do you think? Do you think NASA and, the Russian Space Agency will still be around 40 years from now? And I know that that's kind of a silly question, but as we get more involved with Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic and some of those, where do you kind of see the future of government and space, or do you think it's going to be more tourism?
Well, I'm very pleased at where we're at with commercial space right now. You mentioned SpaceX earlier. That is coming along very well. There are several other entities out there like Blue Origin that are getting into businesses. And they are going to be involved even on the moon program. I think the role of the government is to push the boundaries, and then commercial follows in behind them. It's like in aviation, the government was the pushing on the airplanes, and then they finally started doing commercial stuff. That's the way I see it, the future. And as you mentioned, NASA doesn't build things; we test things, but we hire contractors to do the building. So it's always been commercial entities involved in everything that we've done in space.
No, for sure. And then I just want to close with, what advice would you have to future people? Of course, it's changing. Yes, there is a lot of people in the military that do end up going to become astronauts, but you see people, with more MIT degrees, because a lot of things are with coding have changed the way that we do things. What advice would you have, though, for the best way for people to get involved, and not just be an astronaut, but maybe to be involved in the space agency in some way? What would you suggest an 18-year-old to do?
Always advise young people to study something that they think they would enjoy doing, whether it ends up being working with space or not. So engineering is always a good way because there's lots of NASA uses lots of engineers, and engineers are the basis for building things. But you know, geologists are going to be involved in everything that we do. We use astronomers. The class of 1978 of astronauts that we brought on board started to broaden the scope of the type of backgrounds that NASA wants to, but study something that you enjoy, and it may have an application in space, but you should enjoy it even if you're doing it down here on Earth.
Appreciate that. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Jacob Buer show. We really appreciate it, as in the guests who are listening and the other people. So I appreciate it so much. Is there anything else you'd like
You're
to
quite
say?
welcome, Jake.
Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Well, enjoyed chatting with you, and good luck on your future.
Thank you.